Good afternoon and welcome to the Dibble Institute's March 2021 webinar. My name is Kay Reed. I'm the Executive Director of the Dibble Institute and I'm pleased to have you all here. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. Should you lose your audio, the easiest thing to do is to find your originating email with some phone numbers that you can call in on. That's usually how it's handled. And many of us are so experienced now at this that I'm sure you'll figure all that out. We're going to be asking some polls. I'm going to be asking you to raise your hand, and of course, please ask your questions of Dibble or our speaker in the question box. Before I begin, I would like let's use that in your control panel, the little hand up sign, the little hand sign. If this is your very first Dibble webinar, if this is your very first inaugural Dibble webinar, would you please raise your hand? We're going to see how many. All righty. Well, most of you are experienced Dibble webinar people, so thank you for coming back. And to those of you who are new, a special welcome to you. We do this every Wednesday. Sorry, not, thank goodness, not every Wednesday. Every second Wednesday of the month at 1 o'clock Pacific, 4 o'clock Eastern. So we're pleased to have you here today. Esther, the next slide. Esther is our engineer today. Hi, Esther.
Hello.
So the Dibble Institute, for those who are new, is a national independent nonprofit. And our mission is to help young people gain agency in their intimate relationships. We do this by turning research into practical teaching tools that then people like you in the field teach to young people. And so we couldn't do our mission. We're not a direct service provider. We couldn't fulfill our mission without the help of all the organizations that purchase our materials and then use them in the field. And we're so excited because there's so many interesting places people are using our materials. In schools would be obvious, but not so obvious might be children's residential centers or at homeless shelters or in correctional programs. So we're really thrilled with all the very interesting places and the needs we're meeting in young people for this kind of education. And the Dibble, so a key part that you need to know about the Dibble Institute, next slide, Esther, is that we're focused on research, that our materials are based in research and we follow the research. But beyond the content of our materials, we as an organization follow research and what makes for successful nonprofit organizations. So many of you run organizations, or maybe someday will run an organization, and that's a whole skill set that you don't have to invent the wheel on. You can actually learn from others and learn how to be successful. So it's with that spirit that we bring you these speakers from Project Evident to talk about some new techniques and approaches to planning and thinking through organizational approaches. Now, we're all very aware right now, today's March, what is it, 8th or 9th? I guess it's the 9th. It was a year ago that our lives changed. I mean, it's been an indescribable year. I would not be exaggerating, and I'm sure you all feel the same, that it's been indescribable both personally as well as organizationally. And I know for the Dibble Institute, I mean, I felt like we were a ballerina doing a pirouette, you know, like super quickly, all during March. We got our first Zoom account on March 12th. And then we had to upgrade it on March 16th. So we, like many of you, were busy trying to figure out how to make this all work. Now at the Dibble Institute, we've been doing strategic planning for years and years. And it's not just a feel-good project that my board wants us to do and then we put it on the wall. It's a document that really helps us look around and say, what are the threats and what are the opportunities and how do we move from point A to point B? But we never had to move as quickly as we did last year. And we did, as in retrospect, and Sarah DeTroia will help us see, with scenario planning. You have this situation, how do we work in this exact situation? So Project Evident, which is a nonprofit based on the East Coast in Boston, helps other nonprofits thrive. We had Gregor Thomas speaking in October on testing small changes. It's a great webinar. I recommend that to you. Next month, we have Gabriel Rhodes, who's going to talk about creating and using a learning agenda. But today, we have Sarah DeTroia to address the content around scenario planning. So, Esther, the next slide. Sarah is a senior project advisor at Project Evidence. She has many years of experience in all sides of nonprofit management: investor, grant maker, strategic advisor, nonprofit leader. And so she's integrated this whole idea of nonprofit and market and melded them together into thinking about how nonprofits can meet the current needs of the people that are around them and in their mission area. She works with philanthropic foundations as well as other national nonprofits. So we're thrilled to welcome today Sarah DeTroia to talk about scenario planning. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you, Kay. It is really a delight to be here with Dibble and be here with all of you. I will tell you, as passionate as you are about your work and working with young people and working around relationships, I am as passionate about thinking about strength of organization and sustainability about organizations. So it's really a thrill for me to get to talk to all of you. Before we kind of jump into the work, and I really hope that throughout the conversation that you pop your questions into the question box. We will spend at least 15 minutes at the back end of this presentation really answering your questions. This is going to feel a little more like a chalk talk as I kind of walk through ways that you can do scenario planning, but my goal is that you truly exit this conversation with a set of tools that you feel like you can use to enhance your personal management of your own work, as well as the management of your organization's work. So I just want to start by understanding how many of you have used scenario planning. So Esther, I know we were going to put up a poll, and so can we put up the poll around just understanding who's used scenario planning at work?
Yeah, if you could all go ahead and raise your hand if you've used scenario planning before, and then we'll have a few other questions.
Perfect.
And it looks like we have a few, but I would not say many, Sarah.
Sounds good. Esther, will you ask the other questions so that we can just get a sense of who's in the room and sort of what they've done thus far?
Absolutely. So our first poll is, how difficult has it been for you to steer your organization through pivots in the last year? Has it been easy or very difficult? Okay. I would say that we're headed more for the difficult side of things here, Sarah.
That certainly makes sense given the year that we've had. I think one of the things that we'll do together in talking about scenario planning is part of it is the thinking behind scenario planning is how do you make sure that everybody in your organization has a similar understanding of the context in which you're operating. It's kind of like the air you're breathing. And the challenge of the last year is that things have been so dysregulated. There have been so many uncertainties, whether you're thinking about racism or you're thinking about environmental degradation or you're thinking about public health challenges, economic disruption. I mean, it's been an extraordinary set of uncertainties in the market in our world. And I think the real challenge with that is that how you are perceiving what tomorrow might look like or the next week might look like can be really different than your colleague or really different than the client that you're working with. And so part of scenario planning is actually getting a shared understanding of when we talk about the future, what are we talking about? Not that anyone's clairvoyant, but we're going to come to a shared agreement of when we plan for next week, what do we think next week's context, what is that air going to feel like when we're in that following week? I think some of the difficulty we have sometimes in helping people move through change is that everyone has a different reality that they're planning for in their own heads. The scenario planning is a way to try and bring people into a shared reality knowing that we're not clairvoyant, knowing that there's still going to be uncertainty, but creating alignment around understanding of what context is we're operating. So then you can have conversations about what are logical trade-offs for how we might move forward. Esther, do you want to share our next poll?
Absolutely. So for the pivots that your organization has made in the last year, how diverse was the team that gave inputs to those changes? All right.
So definitely trending towards less diverse. Now, obviously, part of that is the urgency with which people felt like they had to move. So when you're dealing with staff safety and some of the other things that that organizations have had to deal with in the past year, folks might have to move very quickly. One of the things I really like about scenario planning is it can actually be a very big tent activity for an organization. And we're going to talk about how you use this tool for yourself as well as for your organization. So I don't want you to think that like, oh, this is only a tool for managers. I actually think the elements of this tool can be really applied quite broadly. But I think what I really like about this is in developing futures, more diverse perspectives actually gets you a more nuanced and a more resilient understanding of what the future could look like than if you have fewer perspectives. And it can end up being kind of a unifying activity for an organization as a way of developing a shared understanding of, again, the context in which you're working. So with that, we're going to launch into some of the knowledge here. I just want to quickly introduce the organization. If you wouldn't mind moving us forward, please, Esther. So Project Evident, which Kay had mentioned, we're an organization that's based in Boston. It's really focused on sustainability of organizations, both financially, but also in terms of impact. And the theory on this is that for too many organizations, evidence building is something that's happening to them instead of something that's happening for them and with them. At the end of the day, building evidence is just learning. Organizations need to learn to better serve communities. They need to learn to strengthen themselves over time and to adapt. We've certainly all done a lot of learning in the past year. Unfortunately, we feel like a lot of organizations around evaluation and evidence are really set up as a way to kind of provide accountability as opposed to provide learning. And our goal is to really create a set of tools and supports and skill enhancements so that organizations can really be in charge of their own learning agenda and be in charge of their own evidence building for their needs and for their community's needs. So that's the goals behind Project Evident. Esther, if you wouldn't mind moving us forward, please. So certainly the last year has been, sort of defined by crises. I mean, in the March, as Kay was referencing, the time when COVID first really became upon us, who would have thought that within 2 months' time, we'd be talking about Black Lives Matter as a pandemic of racism. So clearly the Black Lives Matter movement predated the events of last summer, but that became the most significant conversation that we were having. And then that was followed by incredible environmental degradation with the wildfires on the West Coast. So this sort of cycling urgencies over the last year. When you are in a crisis, the most precious commodity that you have is time. Anything you can do in advance to plan for alternate futures is actually going to buy you time when you're in those moments of urgency. And that's one of the reasons why I really encourage scenario planning. I do want to pause for a little bit of like, why now for scenario planning, and sort of why haven't we been doing this, I guess, in the past? I think one of the things I've found in the nonprofit sector, scenario planning is actually a pretty common tool that's used in the for-profit sector. As organizations are planning for their budgets, as they're planning for future markets, as they're rolling out new products, there's a lot of work done around kind of what a positive scenario might look like, what a middle scenario, what a less positive scenario might look like. And that just hasn't really been a tool that I've seen used as much in the nonprofit sector. And so it feels like we've been playing a little bit of catch up in the past year in terms of understanding just how to do basic scenario planning. I think the other thing that I've found among nonprofits is there can really be an inward-facing bias. So we're focused on our clients, we're focused on ourselves, we're really not focused on what's happening sort of outside in our community or in our state or across the country. That there are few people inside of our organization that really have a predominantly externally facing role and are sensing kind of broader trends that are happening in our particular neck of the woods, in our field or in our state, et cetera, et cetera. I think certainly from the last year, the urgent has trumped the important. And folks across the spectrum have felt an incredible amount of burnout. And so adding another tool or another planning has felt maybe like a lot for some organizations. And so they haven't picked up on scenario planning. And I think the other thing is that people have been awash in change. And scenario planning really does put change front and center. Because it talks from the very beginning about the fact that the environment in which you're working is likely to change. And so it's getting organizations comfortable with change. Esther, if you wouldn't mind advancing the slide, please. So just for a moment, like what is scenario planning and how does it really differ from annual planning? If you will advance the slide. So what is annual planning? I mean, all of us obviously have gone through some amount of annual planning. You typically are planning for a single future. So if you're approving a budget or approving a program for the following year, you're planning for, we're gonna reach 10 people and it's gonna cost us $10. And you're not necessarily thinking about what if it's 20 people or what if it costs us $9.50 or what are these different futures? What could they look like? Typically, it's a single future you're planning for. It's often a one and done activity, right? It's a relatively short time horizon. We plan in the spring or we plan in, in December, and then we have our plan for the following year. It's very internally focused. Folks are not often looking at what could happen outside the organization. Oftentimes, while I don't recommend this, it's created by the top of the house inside of an organization. So it's created by leadership and it kind of gets cascaded through the organization. But a very few set of people are actually involved in that planning process. And there's just very low prospects of change that are contemplated over the course of the year. Again, that's planning for a single future. That does really differ from scenario planning. So the purpose of scenario planning is you're planning for multiple futures. It is actually an iterative tool. It is not a one and done tool. So part of what we'll talk about today is what are the steps that you go through with scenario planning, but then how do you keep refreshing this scenario planning as more information unfolds about what the future could look like. It's very externally focused. So we're going to talk about critical items that are actually outside of your control, not inside of your control, not internally focused. There's a real strength, as I've already said, in the diversity of perspectives. So the more diverse and ideally externally facing folks that you can bring into the room, virtual room or physical room in this activity, the stronger and more resilient and more nuanced, frankly, your scenarios will be. And then there's just a higher prospect of change. You're recognizing from the very beginning that you're not clairvoyant, that you're planning for multiple scenarios, and even those scenarios you're going to keep refreshing over time. So that's the purpose of scenario planning. It really has change and uncertainty built into it, but the goal is to still enable you to harness what might be alternate futures to allow you to still make good decisions in planning. Esther, would you advance the slide, please? So I want to talk for a moment about starting powerfully. Now, first, a lot of what I'm going to talk about over today's conversation is going to be kind of tips and tricks around how to actually run these types of scenario planning workshops inside of an organization or with a group of people. The reality is that multiple of the steps of scenario planning you could actually do for yourself. So even in your own work, I mean, it could even be around managing your own household of how do you think about alternate futures around elements that are really important for you organizationally or just you as an individual. So a lot of my kind of talking will be about how you run this as a team operation, but know that there are also elements here that you can run, you can just do for yourself around self-management. So in terms of starting powerfully, I think it's really important to think about both diversity and think about diversity not only in traditional sort of ethnic, racial diversity, but also to think about diversity of just perspectives and lived experiences that you want to have contributing to your development of future scenarios. Again, I love this activity because it can be a big tent activity. I think I've run it with as many as Virtually, I've run it with as many as 25 people. In a room, you can actually run it with far more people than that, but breakout rooms, things get a little bit harder to run virtually, but you can run it with as many as 25 people. So you could really think about external stakeholders you might want to invite into the conversation. You could think about board members. You can think about diverse staff. And so I really, thinking very powerfully from the very beginning of like whose voice is underrepresented in my organization and would really be powerfully represented in helping me understand what the futures could look like. The second thing I'd like you to think about when starting powerfully is informal leadership. So ultimately, when you're thinking about scenario planning, again, we've talked about the very essence of scenario planning is acknowledging that change is going to happen. And often, as we already saw in the poll, like actually getting our organizations, our colleagues, our employees, family members, sort of ready for change and embracing change can be really hard. And one of the best ways to support people around experiencing change is to have people that they trust be part of the ambassadors, part of the communicators around change. So when you think about an organization, I think about formal leaders. So those are folks who have titles that sort of confer authority on them. But I also think a lot about informal leaders. Informal leaders are people in your organization who essentially are the culture carriers. This could be frontline staff, it could be administrative staff, it could also be one of your VPs. But it's the folks that people look to and say, well, if Romero says that, I trust him. I trust Romero, he's been here for a long time. I know he's always on the side of the mission, et cetera, et cetera. And it's important that you have folks like that who are part of your scenario planning as well, because ultimately you need to communicate this to the rest of your organization. So if everybody is not going to be in the virtual room, and again, as I've said, it can be hard to just logistically organize that, you need to think from the beginning about how you're going to communicate what happens inside the scenario planning to the rest of your organization. One of the sort of sayings that I often give managers is 5 times 5 ways communication. As you well know, it's been an extraordinarily busy year, and that people are working very hard trying to deliver the basics of their jobs, often in really difficult circumstances. And the idea that they can absorb new information while they're doing so much to do their current work is a little bit of folly. And so I really encourage managers to not get frustrated with teams not really cluing into or remembering or making a part of their daily habit new information until it's been repeated to them at least 5 times. If you say something 5 times, that should actually start beginning to sink into your colleagues and into the organization. But when you think about repeating things 5 times, you also have to remember that adults predominantly intake information in 4 different domains. So folks listen, some folks get their best information by reading, others through pictures, and some through physical action like writing. So that's the 5 ways. I can't just tell people something 5 times in a newsletter. That's only going to hit the group of adults inside of my organization who best absorb information by understanding it, by reading it. I have folks who better understand it through pictures and better understand it through hearing. So I just really encourage you to think about diversity of communication inside your organization as you go into your scenario planning, because ultimately this is an aligning activity so that your whole organization understands the future in which you're operating. Esther, would you please advance the slides? So there are 5 basic steps in scenario planning, and we're going to break down each one of these and talk a little bit about how you set this up as a meeting or a conversation with a set of folks. There's determining external uncertainties, and these are the uncertainties that are most powerful and meaningful to your organization or to you personally. The next step is creating 3 scenarios. I typically just name those as, there's a sunny scenario, those uncertainties all break in my direction. There's a rainy scenario, few of those uncertainties break in my direction. And then there's kind of a cloudy, like a kind of a mixed sun kind of cloudy scenario where some things go right and some things go wrong. So the development of those scenarios. And then the third part is determining market signals. So for each one of those external uncertainties, keying that to a way of understanding whether or not that uncertainty is happening or not happening. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Next, we talk about creating a game plan for each scenario so that you actually have some thinking already in place. And then the iterative part of the work is updating, basically looking at those market signals every 1 to 3 months, depending on the velocity of how quickly things are moving against your uncertainties. And that ultimately gives you the full cycle of scenario planning. Esther, would you please advance? And just one more advance, please. Perfect. So let's talk a little bit about determining the determining external uncertainties. So, no doubt you have countless uncertainties right now that you're facing individually and inside your organization. The key thing to do in this piece of the exercise is to actually identify the uncertainties that have the greatest determination of the future, either for yourself or for your organization. So what I really encourage people to think about are the factors over which you have no control that are most meaningful for the success of yourself or your organization. If I'm setting this up as a team conversation, if I have 30 people in a virtual conversation, let's say, or even 15 people, I'll often break people into smaller groups, so into 5 smaller virtual breakout groups. Sorry, 5 people into 3 virtual breakout groups. Allow them to brainstorm those external uncertainties and then force them to narrow. And when we come back into the main room, perhaps each of those breakout groups can only bring 3 uncertainties. And you'll see that there'll be some overlap amongst those groups. What's really important when you do this is that these are truly things that are outside of your control. So like an easy example might be whether or not we meet budget at the end of the year. That actually might feel like it's outside your control, but the reality is that you can make a ton of very difficult and tough decisions to force the organization to meet budget by making cuts. Whether or not a funder is going to fund you is entirely outside of your control. So it's important as you're doing that exercise that sometimes people will let things creep in that are actually inside their control, but it requires them to make tough choices. If you're able to make tough choices to actually address those uncertainties, then they're probably inside your control, not outside of your control. The other thing is, while I just gave you a financial uncertainty, it's really important that you have both financial and program uncertainties when you're determining those external uncertainties. This is not just about your budget. This is not just about the finances of the organization. There are significant uncertainties about whether or not your organization can actually create impact, which is the reason you're in the work. It's your mission. It's what brings you to work every day. So don't let financial uncertainty overshadow what are programmatic and impact uncertainties that are equally important as you think about the health of the organization moving forward. The next step is creating 3 scenarios. And again, as I said, it's a sunny, it's a cloudy, and it's a rainy. I typically, again, divide people, if I'm doing a virtual webinar around this, into smaller groups. So I give them 3 breakout groups. They're only allowed 1 scenario. So there's a sunny group, there's a rainy group, and there's a cloudy group, and they're only trying to build out that scenario. They use the external uncertainties that we just determined. That's the spine. So what I often kind of say to them is, those are the chapter headings. I want you to write me the first sentence for that chapter. So if the uncertainty was whether COVID would be under control in my community, then if that was the uncertainty, then the chapter heading in a cloudy scenario is vaccines take longer to roll out than anticipated. So it happens later. It takes longer than we thought it would. And a sunny chapter might be that virus is under control in the community, quarantine is kept, and vaccines roll out smoothly, and it happens within a 6-month time frame. So, different ways of starting to write that first sentence of that chapter heading around an uncertainty. When you're done creating the 3 scenarios, come back into the room, into your virtual room, and I allow each group to present out their scenario. And I really encourage people to look at patterns that emerge across all 3 of those futures. Because what you often find is, regardless of the weather, there are some changes and some things you want to invest in right now. Because regardless if it's sunny or cloudy or rainy, we have to change the way we reach out to our clients. The old way isn't going to work anymore. We know we're going to have to do something different. And that can begin prioritizing for you investments or changes you want to make, even in advance of knowing what the future is going to look like. Esther, could you advance us to the next? The last piece here is determining market signals. So for each one of those uncertainties, I want you to look for lead or lag indicators to understand which future you're living in. So again, let's talk about COVID spread. So COVID spread could be, a lag indicator might be, what is the infection rate in my community, right? That's a lag indicator. A lead indicator might be, what is the relative types of quarantining that's happening in my community, since that's a leading indicator of whether or not there will be a lag indicator of actual COVID cases in my community. So those market signals actually help you get out ahead, particularly those leading indicators, so that you actually can anticipate what future, whether it's cloudy, sunny, or rainy, you might be living in. Another lead indicator might be how long the shelter in place and quarantining is in place for domestic violence cases showing up. So again, being able to watch quarantines could tell you something that might be a programmatic demand that you're going to have later on, and knowing around quarantines would allow you to better prepare if that's a leading indicator. There's a little bit of gap of time before the lag indicator shows up. Esther, would you please advance? So if you're thinking about this, and I'd say those 3 past steps are steps that you can use for yourself. So that those can be used for an organization, for a team, a subset of an organization, or they can be used around self-management, around how am I managing my household. The next couple of steps are really about, how do you think about this from an organizational perspective? I think one of the things that I saw a lot of over the last year is that people were pivoting. They were making changes programmatically. They were making changes operationally just to react to what was happening in their communities and what they heard was needed from their clients, but they weren't necessarily revisiting their theory of change. Now, a theory of change, whether that's your at the highest level of theory of change, or it is actually your program logic model, there's some elements of how you thought your program would work, or how you thought you create change in the world, that is not as possible given the level of uncertainty that's happening. And so what I encourage you to do before you move to the next 2 steps of scenario planning is to dust off your theory of change, take it off the shelf, look at it, and to really start to surface what might have been implicit assumptions baked into your theory of change that frankly may no longer be possible. So that could be like the fact that your staff used to be in person with your clients, the availability of public transit for people to visit your program, the mental health and wellness of your program participants, and what might be their current priorities relative to the work that you previously did with them. So those all might be implicit assumptions that were baked into your theory of change that actually are no longer possible given the shifts that have happened, or given some of those scenarios that you've developed. And what I encourage you to do is to really brainstorm sort of new hypotheses for activities or assumptions that you could actually substitute. So, the easiest one, and one I think most organizations have embraced, is if I can't meet with you in person, I'm going to meet with you virtually, and that's going to look slightly different. And then also think about whether or not there's short-term or medium-term outcomes in your theory of change that you actually want to hibernate. I think one of the hardest things for us to do in the social sector is to actually stop doing some aspects of our program model. No one gets into this work to say no. No one gets into this work to not support your community and not support your clients. And I think it's really hard for organizations to recognize when there's some things that frankly aren't going to deliver the level of impact that you're used to delivering. And it's a really important conversation to have about what you're going to stop doing, because chances are you're going to add on a bunch of things that you're going to start doing to react to these new scenarios that you've developed. Esther, would you bring us forward? And just one more, thank you. So once you have your scenarios of sunny and cloudy and rainy, the next step, not surprisingly, is actually to develop is actually to develop some game plans about what that would look like. So again, that reviewing of your theory of change, your program logic model, right? That's step one, what has to hibernate. And also, are there new opportunities based on these scenarios? In that rainy scenario might be a huge new opportunity for you individually, for your team, or for your organization, and an opportunity to really serve your clients in a new way. It may be, as you're creating that game plan, that there are different capabilities that are needed due to hibernation or of new opportunities. So if there's something that you used to do that relied on a particular set of capabilities that frankly is not possible to do anymore, maybe those capabilities don't need to be represented as significantly inside your organization. And there are new capabilities that are required, frankly, in order to be able to take advantage of new opportunities. So really thinking about the skill base that's needed, either due to hibernation or new opportunities. The next is really learning agenda for any innovation. And as Kay mentioned, your next Dibble session is really about building learning agendas for organizations. Whenever you embark on new activities, I really recommend that people, build learning agendas. Innovation is, it is an opportunity to learn, and most likely you're not going to get it right the first time. And so really looking at what are we trying to learn by doing this? What's the iterative nature of the learning agenda and of the innovation work, so we get the most out of the new things we might be trying in these new scenarios. And then finally, there is a budget piece of this as well, which is just what's the budget? If some things are being hibernated, some new opportunities we're going after, what's the budget that's going to support the new program and strategy? Again, I really encourage doing this for all three, having a game plan for all three of those scenarios, and thinking a little bit at a high level what your budget might look like, how it might be different under those three scenarios. And then Esther, if you could advance us. So the last piece is this iterative process of actually looking at those key market signals on a 1 to 3 month basis. Again, this is how often you choose to look at these scenarios, look at the market signals, is really dependent on how quickly things are moving in your marketplace, right? So, or in your field or your community, however you boundary sort of how your activity is happening. There are some sectors right now that are just changing day to day. I mean, the healthcare sector and emergency room management, that's changing every day. And for a while, as cities, we were looking at COVID reporting numbers on a daily basis. You couldn't wait a month to look at those numbers. There might be other, but things aren't moving that quickly around your indicators. It may be that you only need to look at them quarterly or only need to look at them monthly. So the first is really to determine what that cadence is. The second is you got to assign responsibility for this. So what you don't want to have happen, and I loved how Kay talked about the strategic planning work that she's done, that it's not something that lives on a shelf, that it's actually a living, breathing document inside their organization that truly helps guide the actions and align the team. Same thing is true here, right? So if you do scenario planning once, it's a point in time exercise. It's not going to stay fresh. You have to keep looking at it. And so knowing that there's a cloudy scenario, a rainy scenario, and a sunny scenario doesn't help you if you're planning for sunny, because that's what the market signals are telling you. And in fact, like the winds are starting to pick up, the barometer is starting to drop, and actually things are about to change. And you'll know that if you're actually doing the work about assigning somebody to keep checking in on those lead and lag indicators. So when you do those lead and lag indicators, it's a good idea to be reporting them out. I talked earlier about how are you communicating these scenarios to your organization, and then how are you communicating the game plans that are coming out of that into your organization. And then finally, how are you keeping the organization abreast of those market signals so that everybody's aware of how the context in which you're operating might be changing, and how that could be driving different choices that are going to be made by management or need to be made by other folks inside of your organization. Esther, would you bring us forward? Oh, well, that was the last slide. There you are. If you look to the side of the webinar, you'll see 3 documents that are there. The first is just the scenario thinking slide deck, which is the slides that I went through. So you have a copy of those if you want to use those internally, or just to remind yourself. But there's also a scenario thinking worksheet that really walks you through each of these steps. Again, you can use it individually, you can use it inside of your organization. And I also have a sample filled out template there just to give you an idea of how one organization completed this, just to give you a little bit of an example. So I'm going to pause there and move to questions.
Well, and we have some. Sarah, great presentation. I love planning. So, woohoo. So Eric asked, have you designed scenarios by crossing two uncertainties to create a quad chart with a rainy, a sunny, and two alternative cloudy scenarios?
Interesting. So I haven't, but that doesn't mean that you can't. So I think at the end of the day, you need to have a manageable number of uncertainties. One, to look at patterns across them. But also, one of the things that I like to do with organizations, if the scenario work is then going to move truly into planning work, that I ask people to choose like which is the scenario you think is most likely going to have happen. So that's if they're at the beginning of doing sort of longer strategic planning versus the game planning that I talked about in this work. If you actually are at a place in your organization's life cycle that you have to actually develop a 3-year plan for funding reasons or what have you, I really encourage them to choose one of those realities that you think is most likely to happen, and we'll use that as an anchor point for developing a strategic plan for the organization. So I think going up to 4 futures is fine. I think beyond that, my experience is that it just gets too confusing. So particularly as you think about how you're going to communicate this back out to your stakeholders and to your organization, 4 futures starts to feel like a lot for people to hold on to. 3, most people can hold on to 3 in a communication process, but that could mean that you develop 4 scenarios and then choose the 3 most likely or the 2 most likely, and then those are really what you're communicating on.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So Eric has a second question. When you design scenarios, what are your thoughts on the length and details to include? Are you drafting prose, or are basic bullet points enough?
Yeah, so I think I have 2 answers for this question, Eric. So one is, what do you do in the room? And then, what do you do for communication outside of the room? So I find that people can get really hung up on wordsmithing when you move them into narrative form. And so typically I try and make the exercises as simple as possible, for teams of 5 to 10 people to be actually, to do the work in kind of a 40-minute breakout session, let's say a 35 to 40-minute breakout session. And so there I actually take the key uncertainties, and again, I didn't say this previously, when we build key uncertainties, I try and keep it to 8 to 12. More than 12, it's too many uncertainties to start seeing patterns, and likely some of those uncertainties are not as critical to determining your future as others. So that's why we do the breakout of brainstorm of uncertainties, and then prioritization in the small groups, and then bring people back together and do a little bit of like, where's the overlap? So you can get about, again, 8 to 12 uncertainties. So when I take those uncertainties and I use those as the spine in the second breakout group, and then just ask people to do 1 bullet point under each of those uncertainties. And I really encourage people not to do, super run-on sentences. I try and ask people to be relatively concise and not to pack everything in there. That said, that's the artifacts that get developed in the scenario work. That then gets taken and you start thinking about, how do I want to communicate about this? You can move that into fully baked prose if that's a way that people inside your organization are more used to hearing information be shared. Or you might want to bake that into prose for grants, because that's the format that grants are most likely to appear in. So it starts to depend around how people receive information inside your organization. And again, I'm really just going to encourage people to think about the different types of learning and the way people metabolize information. So it shouldn't just be prose. Think about pictures. It shouldn't just be pictures. Think about talking about it verbally inside of a staff meeting.
So Sarah, I have a question, and I have a feeling that many on this call today experienced this year, and that was just how to do this quickly. So, I mean, you, in an ideal world, you were able to reach out to your stakeholders, and you have a facilitator, and you have a meeting, and that's all really good. But this last year, it felt like it's Monday. I need to get a planning group together Wednesday. And, you know, I mean, in Dibble, we were meeting, literally, we had a small team and we were meeting 3 times a week for like 2 months because things were happening so quickly. So just curious if you had any thoughts on, or, you know, your facility could burn down, there could be a riot in your town. I mean, there's all these other things that could be happening. So any other things you would do differently if it was quick?
Right. So I think if you're going to lavish time on a scenario planning activity, it's probably a 2.5-hour activity. You run as a virtual session with, let's say, 15 to 30 people. That gives you enough time to get people settled into the exercise, moving people in and out of breakout groups, and sort of each stage of the exercise. There's a little bit of planning that happens in advance of that, because again, I'm asking you to think about how you're going to communicate on the other side and who's the ideal people to have in the room. So that's if you're lavishing time on this. And that doesn't include what's the iterative nature of this? How often are we coming back together and looking at these key indicators, looking at these market signals, and adjusting our scenarios based on that? I think that if you had to do this really quickly, I've done it, I've facilitated it's easier if it's smaller groups, right? So that if you're going to do it faster, I'm going to tell you that you're going to have to err on, a smaller tent activity. So if you want to do it with your executive team or with 5 people inside your organization or 7 people inside your organization, you could probably take the worksheet and bang it out, in an hour and 15 minutes. You're not doing the breakout groups. You're basically all staying together and you're just working through the worksheet, and you just have your eye on the clock and you really move through it. I think the updating on the scenarios is something that you could actually bake into, Kay, I think many organizations were doing them multiple meetings a week, and then they were doing it once a week. And I think many places are still doing, multiple, either once a week or maybe 2 touchdowns a week, just to see what's shifted in our community. Doing the updating work you can do relatively quickly if you have somebody who is coming back into the room and reporting on those market signals. And then basically the work in the room is 20 minutes on, does that make us think any differently about the scenario we're living in right now and we're planning for right now? If it does, how does it change it? And how does that affect our game plan? So that can be a relatively tight kind of 20-minute update if you've done the work in advance. Again, the work of the scenario planning prepares you for the change, right? Because you've already begun building a flexibility in your organizational mindset and a nimbleness of what to do if things go up, down, or sideways. And so it allows you to actually operate faster when a riot happens in your community, a building burns down, or some other big shift happens that you weren't expecting. Which one of our scenarios does that most likely fall into? And how else we choose to enhance that scenario based on this particular reality that's come to happen.
Thank you. That's really helpful. It seems less intimidating when you only think of a 2-hour slot and then ongoing time. So Martin has an excellent question. Can you give an example of an organization where this planning worked, so we can kind of understand from an outcome perspective how scenario planning worked?
Sure. So I'm trying to get one that would actually be helpful for you in your sector. So I have done this with a IPA that's based in New York City. And it was, sorry, it is a, what does it stand for? Essentially, it is a group of federally qualified healthcare centers, homelessness organizations, and harm reduction around opioid addiction, a set of organizations that have bound together to actually work with insurers. So insurers were thinking about what are ways that we can actually address the social determinants of health, in addition to sort of more narrowly defined health inside of a healthcare system. And so that it was, essentially it was pulling together as a bargaining group. And so we were looking at what do we think the market is going to be for particularly harm reduction. So what is happening with harm reduction? How is healthcare looking at insurance companies looking at harm reduction? And in light of COVID. And so we were looking at some of the things that were outside of their control is what is happening with opioid addiction in light of COVID, and it's going through the roof. What is happening with insurance around changing norms around whether or not detoxing people is ethical, is considered to be ethical or unethical when they arrive in emergency rooms. We were looking at what was happening at, this was, sort of the HHS inside of New York State in terms of what was on their hands, what was on their agendas in terms of COVID. And so their ability to actually look at opioid addiction, and was there still going to be room for that? And so we did a scenario planning around what is a world in which harm reduction is really one of the things that is going to get funded and that is going to have a lot of attention associated with it, and what if it really gets crowded out in the marketplace. And that allowed this group of providers to figure out how much effort they wanted to put into trying to actually advocate and negotiate with insurance providers in New York City around harm reduction as a benefit that they could provide for some of their covered lives. So that's a way that it was used, just for them to help thinking about their own, like, should we hibernate the IPA? Should we actually say that there's not a lot of market here, or should we keep moving forward and trying to resource? And they ultimately decided to hibernate because they just felt like with the focus on COVID and the amount of burnout that was happening inside of the state, that there really wasn't going to be a burnout inside of HHS, that the champions for harm reduction just were not there any longer, and it wasn't going to be possible for them to move forward. So kind of a sad story, but one in which they did not, they didn't burn themselves out trying to, slam themselves against a wall, when in fact the conditions were not right for them to be able to move forward. Also have done a lot of scenario planning, not surprisingly, around after-school programs and education. In terms of what types of services are going to be needed this year and next fall. How traumatized are kids going to be when they show back up in the classroom? What does that mean for learning loss? What does that mean for social emotional learning? And so a lot of work with after-school programs around how they should think about their own programming and what investments they might need to make in their programming so that they're better attuned to where kids are going to be next fall.
So in that case, would an external uncertainty be the state of the young people that come to you? Would that be an external scenario to, like?
Absolutely. But as an external uncertainty they had no control over, and the market signals we were looking at was anxiety, depression, and suicidality showing up in children's hospitals. So that was the lead indicator for us to look at now, is what's happening inside of children's hospitals around mental health, and other research that's being done on youth mental health as a leading indicator for what's going to happen in the school systems. And that's allowing them to get out in front of building new capabilities around social emotional learning into programs that may have been more academically focused in the past, that still are going to have an academic impact, but they have to meet the students where they are, and they're going to be in a much more emotionally fragile place, and they have to therefore amend their programmatic intervention.
That's very interesting. Well, good. Well, thank you so much. Someone just wrote in that she took your weather, this woman said, I just wanted to say this was excellent. I work in University Cooperative Extension, helping communities prepare for, quote, natural disasters. So she took your weather metaphors literally.
Yeah.
So interesting to see what we can learn from social services, especially working on these cascading disasters. So it feels like these are tools that so many of us can use. So I appreciate you sharing, Sarah. And here's her email, obviously, that if anybody wants to contact Sarah post-webinar. Remember, you have over in your control panel the handouts. This recording is going to be archived along with all those handouts. So if you want to share it with others in your organization, we will. It's certainly going to be available on the Dibble website for a long time to come. So appreciate you joining us today. We will be putting this up next. Let's see, today's Wednesday. By Monday for sure, we'll have this webinar loaded. In the meantime, if you want to talk to me or Esther, there are our email addresses. And next month, we're going to have, as I said, our last speaker from Project Evident, and in Sarah's presentation, she talked about learning agenda, which was in like step 4 or 5, I can't remember. And Gabriel Rhodes is going to talk specifically about strategic learning agendas, and he was super excited to make us a tool. Dibble is all about tools and skills, so we're thrilled to have him here. So we're going to give you a 5-minute gift of time today. We're going to stop a little early. We appreciate you coming, and look forward to seeing you next month. Take good care.